Okay, so hi Matthew, we're from Tick 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 and Adopt a Negotiator, and we want to know about this new study, Climate Vulnerability Monitor Part 2. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the editor of the study, and I work at DARA in our climate change program. DARA is a humanitarian research organization based out of Spain, working in developing countries around the world to analyze the effectiveness of aid and impacts of climate change and issues of reducing risk and increasing resilience of populations.
All right, so we were hearing a lot about the cold calculus of climate change, and so would you want to talk to us about what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. The cold calculus of a hot planet, that's the title that we gave to our second report. Basically, in fact, it's a double-sided cold calculus because the report concludes that the fact that we have failed to act to address climate change has actually resulted in one of the primary causes of death worldwide today, because we analyze the amount of human lives that are sacrificed as a result of the increase in temperatures and all the different effects that has for communicable diseases, in particular hunger. But we also analyze at the same time basically what is entailed by business as usual, what is entailed by sticking to a carbon economy with all your guns, because every year we're increasing emissions, and in fact the carbon economy or carbon-intensive development is just becoming bigger and bigger at the moment. And energy projections from major authorities like the International Energy Agency or the US Energy Information Agency, they basically project that process is going to continue and to continue. At the moment, fossil fuel consumption is set to expand rapidly over the next 20 years. Other forms of carbon-intensive development likely to do the same. All of that activity has an incredible human impact. Air pollution, responsible for over 1 million lives lost every year, mainly chronic lung diseases, lung cancer, respiratory diseases. Similar thing for what we call indoor air pollution, which is basically the fact that over 1 billion people around the world who are, many of whom are locked in into difficult lower income brackets, basically have access only to technologies such as, for simply cooking needs or heating needs, that is basically indoor fires of burning coal, wood, etc. inside. That's extremely toxic for human health. I mean, this goes beyond passive smoking, for instance. I mean, this is much, much worse, and the human toll of that is in the millions, actually, every single year. And I mean, it's not a part of the Kyoto, but actually the types of emissions that come when you improperly combust basically fuels like coal and wood in those settings releases a lot of particles that actually have a short-term warming effect and contribute to global warming. And so if we were to both be mitigating, taking action on climate change, not just in developed countries, but also by extending access to sustainable development through developing countries around the world, we would actually be seeing that human impact progressively diminish. And in fact, the fact that we've decided not to act on climate change, we've let it grow, and we're going to see it grow. And so, on the one hand, the cold calculus of a hot planet is that there is an almost incredible human impact of not taking action on climate change. I mean, we estimate that that's in the realm of 100 million lives lost between now and 2030. The other side of the cold calculus of the hot planet is the economic side. This report revised all of the research, if you like, that has been done into different aspects of the economic impact of climate change. We pulled different types of research in order to build what is ultimately 34 different indicators of how climate change and carbon-intensive development affect the world's economies. And we used, wherever possible, the latest research. It's mainly relying on peer-reviewed research that's already published in academic literature, and we pieced it all together. There's only 2 studies similar to that we're aware of that have been conducted since the turn of the century, and the majority of the literature into the global economic impact of climate change dates from the 1990s. In massively updating that work and that body of study, we came to a very different conclusion from earlier studies. The conclusion of this report very clearly and specifically points to climate change and carbon-intensive development as major weights on economic development in general at the moment. We're talking 1% of global GDP already today as a result of climate change. That's losses net. In terms of carbon intensiveness, it adds another magnitude, so that we're looking at over $1.2 trillion worth of economic losses to the world economy today. When you do the sort of longer analysis on that, and you compare it with how much it would cost to fix the problem, just looking even at mitigation, for instance, at reducing emissions, we looked at averages of different studies, medians actually, of different studies who estimate what are the mitigation costs. And for this coming decade, it's in the realm of 0.5% of GDP. So the costs of climate change are already much more significant than the costs that we would face to fix the problem. And when you run that down the long term, this sort of 1% of GDP in the worst business as usual scenario, as we estimate it, could exceed 10% of GDP losses for the world before the end of the 21st century. And so that means that, in fact, the real economic cold calculus of a hot planet is that if you want to make money, if you want to have economic growth, you must tackle climate change. Full stop. That's valid today, now, that's valid into the future, and that's valid for every region of the world. There is not a region that we estimate in this report that either incurs no cost or is not benefiting from action on climate change in an aggressive way. We're talking highest emission scenarios is the IPCC 2.6 scenario. That sounds very technical, but it basically means doing the best attempt to avoid going over 2 degrees Celsius. And I mean, this is a short term, the analysis of this report is built on the short term. So we're only really looking, for the most part, at what is happening now and what's happening in 20 years' time. If you go over 2 degrees, a whole series of different impacts become possible that are not figuring in our analysis. We're talking, for instance, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which almost becomes inevitable when you surpass 2 degrees. That would entail 3 to 4 meters of sea level rise globally in a matter of years. And that type of impact, I mean, we're measuring here the incremental effect of a 3 millimeter increase in sea level rise every year. And the sea level rise indicator, I think, is around 100 billion at the moment. So you can imagine the scale of impacts that we don't even take into account when we say by the end of the century it could exceed 10% GDP. So, I mean, we're just getting into a situation where the only cold calculus that you can make, and we're talking cold-hearted economic terms, is to tackle climate change. And that's the thrust of this book, which bases itself on this reassessment of the state of literature on all the different aspects of the impacts of climate change as they stand today. That's the thrust of it.
While that might be the cold calculus, we still see that there is no commitments on technology. There is the Green Climate Fund is empty, the Adaptation Fund is almost empty, the LDC Fund is almost empty. So, developing countries are not in any position to handle this themselves. So, going ahead, what are your thoughts? I mean, we've had IPCC reports come out before. This is your second vulnerability monitor. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, going backwards through your questions, I would respectfully disagree with the idea that developing countries are not capable of doing it themselves. I mean, the conclusion of the report is that it's an economic benefit for every region. And in fact, it's economically the best benefit for developing regions because carbon-intensive development has its most aggressive negative effects for the economy in poorer countries. So if you're able to shift to a low carbon footing, you're getting more benefits from doing that in those countries. I mean, having said that, of course, we spoke tonight. We had distinguished ministers and delegates from the Climate Vulnerable Forum. On the one hand, you have an example. There was the Maldives. They aim to become carbon neutral by 2020. Costa Rica aims to become carbon neutral by 2021. There are a number of other countries in the group that have similar objectives, and they, of course, they hope to benefit as much as possible from international mechanisms, from support, from everything from technology access. These are technologies that exist in developed countries but are locked out from developing countries, and capacity, etc. But they're trying to do it on their own anyway. And I think, frankly, with a bit of leadership, it's doable almost in isolation, and it would still make monetary and economic sense. The reason why we don't act and why the world is not acting, the reasons are many. One of the reasons, and the reason that this report, very much targets this issue, I think it was Todd Stern, the chief U.S. negotiator, addressing his university, or I can't remember which venue it was, only a few months back, made again the point that how can you get an economy to come to a commitment on reducing emissions when that economy believes that it will penalize their economic growth? Well, the latest analysis, and we're sure that although there can be improvements on this report, that subsequent reports, whether it's us or other people, will validate the conclusions that we have made here. And in fact, it's probably likely to get worse, because the more you further the research, the more you cover more issues. This covers 34. Our first report covered 4. It could probably cover 84 by the next report. And if you start adding up all of these immersive effects of a hot planet, it only goes in one direction. And so, one, there's a knowledge issue, and it's a new subject, climate change. It's taken a lot of effort, energy, years to understand. There's an enormous amount of scientific research going on, thousands of scientists in different countries all working, trying to figure out what is happening, how, to what degree, at what pace, etc. And I think we're moving in a positive direction to understand that. And so we would say to Todd Stern, well, actually it's an economic benefit, and therefore you should be able to convince the constituency, take some leadership, go out and make the test. Because in fact, it's written into the UNFCCC itself that we cannot be taking these types of risks. Countries are actually bound not to take these risks. And there is enough evidence of danger to human lives, to economic well-being, to livelihoods, cultural, historic monuments, natural wonders. The Great Barrier Reef will likely disappear. It may already be committed to disappearance at this stage because we didn't act. When will we move? The other reason is structural reasons. We're locked into a macroeconomic situation of what you might consider a carbon pathology. That's basically that we are in a self-perpetuating carbon-intensive economy. Like I said in the beginning, the main energy institutions of this planet, the International Energy Agency and others, they all point to the same thing. We are increasing carbon intensiveness globally as we're moving ahead. And we're growing population, and we're growing economic wealth. And so when you grow population, economic wealth, and emissions at the same time, it's increasing a lot. And that's a diametric opposite of what we have to be doing if we're tackling climate change. You have, for instance, it was recognized by the IEA, but it was put forward originally by Carbon Tracker, that in fact, if we want to tackle climate change, if we want to actually take action, we need to leave a large part of the fossil fuel resources in the ground. And the implications of that are really quite major for not only oil companies, but also governments, because most of the fossil fuel resources are owned by governments who have voting rights in the UNFCCC. And in fact, if you're having to keep a large part of the resources that you already have, which you could market over the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they lose all their value. And the value of those commodities would plummet. And that's obviously for many people a disincentive to action. In fact, what is happening is the opposite. What is happening is that people are adding to those stockpiles because those stockpiles are worth money as long as we decide not to act on climate change. So if you find more oil and gas and coal, then you add it to the balance sheet of your company or your government, and it gets valued. And then you can take out more money to go and invest in finding more resources, to go and add more to your balance sheet, and it's a perpetual cycle. And it's pathological because what it entails is mass human death, and it entails economic consequences, which are of a scale. I mean, we talk about, since months now, the fiscal cliff. I think even our estimates for economic losses today in the United States are pretty similar to what most economists are estimating are the consequences of the fiscal cliff. And yet, we're not talking about climate change months in advance of the COP in Doha, but we're talking about the fiscal cliff for months in advance. This is pretty much the same order of magnitude, only that climate change is going completely out of control, whereas the fiscal cliff is, pretty contained in comparison.
So I think in conclusion, one of the speakers mentioned that I think and we have very good examples here in terms of countries taking it into their own hands and taking carbon neutral pledges. So do you think we're sort of moving towards a phase where we can easily say that, if a country is not willing to pledge, if a country is not willing to handle this crisis, then we can leave them behind, and individual countries can take the solutions into their own hands, and we'll still be moving in a better direction than we are now?
Well, I mean, firstly, there's only one way forward. Frankly, I think the evidence is now overwhelming. The scientific research behind climate change dates to the 19th century. And all along the way, scientists have said, well, if in 50 years we still see that CO2 rises and temperature rises in tandem, and then we will know. And that was already, predictions from the 1950s that were validated at the end of the century, and every single new report more or less validates or increases the worry on the problem. So we, as a humanitarian organization, analyzing in particular the humanitarian and development impacts of this, I mean, not even to talk about the human rights implications. I mean, there's clearly only one way forward. Now, of course, if there are people who are unwilling to act, then that cannot stop other people from attempting to still secure climate safety for their populations. They have to do it. It's an obligation at the moment, in particular for countries on the front line whose constituencies are beginning to push them, whether in India or Bangladesh or in the Maldives and other places, to actually take aggressive action at home. And so those politicians are feeling that pressure already, and there will be increasing amounts of countries like the Maldives, like Costa Rica and others who will take that path. And it will be those governments and those corporations who are unwilling to diversify and take on the challenge of a low carbon economy who will be the biggest losers. Even major oil companies, the energy companies of the world at the moment, they're not renewable energy companies, they're oil and gas companies. And if we're going to cater to the world's future energy needs, it's very likely to be those same companies, or some of them, that will be catering to whether it's a low-carbon economy or a carbon-intensive economy. But those companies like that who move forward now, who diversify, who respond to pressure from shareholders and activists, fund managers and, whether it's pension funds or otherwise, who are trying to get them to diversify into low-carbon energy sources as providers and suppliers. Those companies will probably do very well, even if for the time being they will still maintain a lot of oil, gas, and coal as we make the transition. But the companies that don't do any diversification, that don't do any R&D into this area, they will be left stranded, and their shareholders face enormous risks of losing large quantities of money when ultimately the world shifts into climate policy. It just takes a couple of economies to ratify targets for emission reductions, and the whole ship will shift to the other side. And that's I guess the perspective on the way forward and how it might evolve.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.